This slideshow has some more detailed notes to help you understand one of the most important and difficult articles in film theory, Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema by Laura Mulvey. It was a 1975 article in the British film magazine Screen. So you see the first page on there. Laura Mulvey, English woman, travels a lot around the world and sometimes in the U.S., but basically in the U.K. Also a scholar, as you can see by all the books behind her, but also a filmmaker. She made a lot of films, avant-garde films in the 70s, connected with some of the same ideas. Tried to summarize very succinctly maybe what the thesis of this article is, and that's that film and television perpetuate unconscious sexism through a male gaze. Okay, we're going to come back to that. Now I'm going to jump into some background. So I said unconscious sexism. So we're thinking about discrimination here. We might think about it as being in conscious or unconscious forms of discrimination. And this applies not only to sex and gender, but also race, ethnicity, age, ability, disability, sexuality, and so on. So when we think of conscious discrimination, you think of explicit policy. This is an example that I found on the internet a couple of years ago at a mall in Florida. There was an ad put out, part-time cleaning position, men only. Please see managers for detail. Well, this is, pretty explicit policy discriminating against women. Women, are not supposed to apply for this job. Now, this kind of conscious discrimination, this is thought of as individual prejudice that somebody has in their mind consciously of what they're doing, and if they could just be educated about that prejudice, then they will be able to stop discriminating. And of course, this kind of discrimination for this job is illegal in the U.S. And the picture was up from a news article calling them out for it. The Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's an unlawful practice to discriminate. You see the list at the end: race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. There'd be later civil rights acts that would add age and disability to that, I believe. And that this is for employment. That's a U.S. law. Okay. Now we're more interested in unconscious discrimination, where we're talking about implicit bias, kind of naturalized social norms, things that we don't seem discriminatory, but they might just be, we're so used to them we don't notice them anymore, and the kinds of practices and institutions, or people called structures, that might perpetuate these discriminations. So here's an example of a road sign, men working. Why is it men working and not women? The naturalized norm there would be that road construction workers are men. And it would be unusual or abnormal for a woman to do it. And so that kind of unconscious discrimination could affect how people feel about, how hiring or how you react to somebody in those kinds of jobs and so forth. I mean, similar things come about in medicine a lot. I just pulled some stock photos here. The classic divide is that, the unconsciously you might see a male doctor, an older male doctor, and they seem trustworthy because I have somehow unconsciously in my mind that a normal good doctor is a man. And on the right, the I have unconsciously in my mind that a nurse is a woman, and they're supposed to, they're supposed to be caring and whatnot. And if you have a male nurse, you might react to that. If you have this kind of unconscious discrimination, it's like, oh, male nurse, what is that? That's something seems wrong with that. That doesn't seem natural. They should be a doctor or something. Or if there's a woman who's a doctor, I don't know if I can trust her so much. These might not be conscious things, but you might, unconsciously, how you behave around people is shaped by these kinds of norms and types or stereotypes. Okay, so we got the idea of unconscious versus conscious discrimination. Where Mulvey comes in is, as part of feminism in the 70s, specifically feminists on the left, they're trying to understand, why does sexism and inequality persist? We had that law in 1964 in the U.S. Why didn't sexism just disappear? Well, of course, it's going to take a while to educate people. Everybody would agree on that. Now, we would see images in the media of normal, life that might have some unconscious discrimination. All the doctors on TV might be still mostly men. And that's pretty understandable. Now, where it gets deeper and where Mulvey's going is to think not what you're seeing, but the way that the films are looking at the world, the way the camera and the editing and the style is a man's perspective. And this is more deeply shaping, people's unconscious, their view of the world in a sexist or unequal way. And the way that that's tied in and hard to change is that there are these ingrained habits of visual pleasure. So the kinds of things that are on the screen, is what's pleasurable, and we keep putting what's pleasurable on there because that's what sells. That's what we like to look at. So if sexism is tied into the things that we find pleasurable, then it's going to be hard to change the way that we see things, the way that we see the world, and the way that movies show the world, because it won't be pleasurable then. So this is going to take some serious thinking and work to overcome. This is pretty deep stuff. And psychoanalysis is her entry into understanding how pleasure works. Sigmund Freud here, looking at us as if we were on the couch in his office being psychoanalyzed. Great photo here. Okay, let's jump into some psychoanalysis, try to understand how pleasure works. And this is the first part of Mulvey's article. She talks about phallocentrism. Phallocentrism, phallus is another word for penis. Simplify it. Phallocentrism is not just mean that the world is focused on the penis. It means that the way that you imagine people in the world is that there's one type of normal person, and that one type of normal person has a penis. When Leonardo da Vinci, draws the Vitruvian man of the, perfect proportion of the human body, it's a man that he chooses. That's the norm. This is the one normal type. And he, nicely drew a penis on there for us, just to make sure we got the proportions right. Okay, so where does woman fit into this world? Well, she doesn't, because there's only one type there's no normal space in the phallocentric way of seeing things for the woman to fit in. So the only way that, on the basic level of the psyche, like the caveman level, how do you make sense of the woman? Okay, well, this is abnormal. Doesn't conform to the normal type because they don't have a penis. So like they're missing a penis. What is going on with this body here? It's abnormal. It's weird. It's so weird. What could it be? One way to make sense of that weirdness in the phallocentric world is that, this is a male body that's had the penis and genitals cut off, castration. So the female figure carries this kind of thread of castration. It's like, whoa, this is abnormal. If you do something wrong, then you're castration. Then you're going to be the weird type that doesn't fit in. Another way to understand it, kind of related, is that maternity, so mothers bearing children, is a kind of wannabe phallus that the woman has a baby, which comes out of the crotch as this kind of like phallus type figure. It doesn't fit exactly. So all it can be understood as this like weird kind of wanting to be the normal type, and also just the woman's body is just a vessel for the man. It doesn't make sense. This is the unconscious. It's psychoanalysis, but you're trying to make sense of this world where there's men and women, when if you're phallocentric, you can only really understand man. So up at the top here, what this third way to think of this a little more generally is that another way of saying the abnormal person is the other. This is the man that doesn't fit in. It's the man who, is breaking the rules, is somehow, a foreigner, who somehow in any way is other, is not normal, is not doing what you're supposed to do. This is where pleasure comes in. That desire is all about transgression, about doing something you're not supposed to do, doing what's naughty. Fantasy, same thing, is about what not the way things really are, but the way they could be in some other world, some fantasy world. Let's jump into this a little bit further. This idea that desire is you want what you can't have. Love this. I found this Maxim cover which just says right on the cover, what guys want. Pretty simple. But where it gets complicated is that how we're understanding the desire of looking is not simply thinking about men wanting woman as a mate for reproduction. What's the pleasure of just looking? If you think about looking as just separate from that, well, psychoanalysis would say there's a pleasure in that, in fantasizing transgression and being outside of the normal world, in a fantasy world, doing what you're not supposed to do. And the way that you live out those fantasies is through the image of the other, which, because we're only in the phallocentric world, the only image of the other that works, well, one way it really works is through the woman. Not just as mate, but as this kind of object for, it could be tied into, how you how you see yourself as other in this other world. There's some kind of circuits of identification that can happen there, and that I can't fully understand. But I will say that the idea is that the pleasure comes from seeing the other, seeing what doesn't fit in. It isn't fun to see just the normal dude, the Vitruvian man. It's the otherness it's because it's different, and almost bad, or not as good as what the normal would be, that you can take pleasure in looking at it. And then that grows into a habit of phallocentrism, and and this is how the pleasure then codes these codes. Let me break this down into 3 points. Okay, the pleasures of entertainment are not harmless, because the pleasure is tied into these the idea is it's tied into these deep kind of psychoanalytic patterns, one of which is phallocentrism. So phallocentrism, or sexism, is coded into Hollywood movies and other forms of media. And the only way to break these patterns and liberate people from unconscious sexism is to analyze it. Okay, now let me go to the next section where Mulvey breaks down a couple different types of visual pleasure. The analysis is breaking down. First, scopophilia. It's Greek roots. Scopo means to look at, like in telescope or microscope. Philia, the love of looking. As I said before, it's not about looking at the genitals of, like, for a man to look at the genitals of a woman and have this kind of mating thing going on. It's not about that. It's more about, it's independent of the genitals. It's more about seeing the other person as an object, kind of like a doll. Seeing other people as dolls, there's a pleasure in that. It's a fantasy of control, like a control over dolls. And there's also voyeurism, which is, if you take it to the extreme, this kind of pleasure of looking and not being seen. There's a great example from Renoir's Day in the Country film, where the Parisian women come out to the country and they're on the swings, and the local guys who are in the restaurant are checking them out through the window. This is a great example both of realism with all these different planes, the different staging and depth that he does, but it's also a conscious way where Renoir knows what this movie is about, is some of the pleasures of looking and the voyeurism of these guys here. And I think there's some kind of setup there. I can't, with like the wine bottle, and I don't know what the heck that is in front of it, that is, I think, made to look like a phallus very cleverly. That's Renoir. Okay, so that was scopophilia. Second kind of pleasure, narcissism. It comes from the myth of Narcissus, who saw his reflection in a pond and turned to stone because he was so in love with looking at his own reflection. So the sense of self-love, that's excessive, and as a personality disorder, or it can be erotic, and seeing yourself and looking at yourself as creating a kind of pleasure. And Mulvey talks a little bit about the psychoanalysis behind that, which I won't get into, but similar kinds of way of understanding the self. But where this becomes interesting is, instead of just the pleasure of seeing yourself in the mirror and recognizing yourself, now in movies we're looking at stars. And rather than seeing ourselves the way we are, it's the ideal. We see ourself the way we want to be. So rather than recognition of ourself, which is one pleasure, it's more pleasure because we misrecognize ourselves as the ideal. And here's an example from Fight Club. Brad Pitt playing the male star here for Tyler Durden. And if you've seen this movie, you know that this is precisely what his character is a fantasy projection of the ideal person that the narrator wants to be. So Fincher is very aware of psychoanalysis in this movie, and Chuck Palahniuk is not quite sure how to pronounce his name, who wrote the novel. So obviously this is a guy's movie, and from the guy's perspective, there's one of the pleasures of watching the movie is imagining yourself as Brad Pitt, basically. So as we transition into the next part of Mulvey's article, just want to say that there's a paradox with woman and the figure of woman in this kind of phallocentric world. So on the one hand, this woman is the object and the vehicle of desire. It's pleasurable to look at, and it's through that kind of pleasure of looking, the desire of what we can have, imagining yourself being a woman, or the imagination of being naughty or being perfect, and all these kinds of ideals are tied in with the woman. On the other hand, the paradox is that she's also the threat of castration. The image of the woman is just always a reminder that you could be castrated. You could have your genitals cut off, or you could socially fall into this lower category, this lower class that's not man. And so it's both desire and threat. This is precisely where the idea of the femme fatale comes in. The femme fatale is a character who's a very attractive, desirable woman, but at the same time has a certain power and is a threat to men. So another character from Fight Club, Marla, is a good example of this. And there's a total inside joke here that she shows up at the support group for testicular cancer because she's precisely that, this threat of castration. Testicular cancer is not, chosen by accident here. This is some heavy psychoanalysis symbolism going on in this movie. And if you know the rest of the story of the movie, there's a part of the story is that the Brad Pitt character, tells the narrator, don't talk about us with Marla. Stay away from her. Keep her at a distance. She is a threat. And it's interesting how that plays out. Okay, so in part 2, we'll continue on into thinking about the how this gets coded into, especially the style of Hollywood movies. This phallocentrism gets coded into the style.